All right, everyone, let's go ahead and kick this off. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy Sunday, wherever you happen to be. I'm Keith Casey, and this is the first Society of Tolkien webinar. It is the first because as of 3 weeks ago, this group, my effort, all these things didn't exist. With that, there's been a ton of controversy, so let me address a couple things. First of all, a lot of people have asked, who is this guy? A little bit of background on myself. I am not an academic. I am not a Tolkien scholar. I haven't spent the last years, decades, millennia studying Tolkien. I'm an electrical engineer by education. I'm a software developer and entrepreneur by trade, and I'm a parent out of love. What I am, though, is I'm a lover of fiction. I'm a lover of fantasy. I'm a lover of adventure. I appreciate the good, the beautiful, and the true. And I saw an opportunity. I saw an opportunity to be able to say, this is a great author. These are some great works. Let's stop and appreciate those. Let's take a few minutes out. Let's take a Saturday morning out or afternoon, whatever the case may be, and stop and appreciate good, beautiful things that we love. So with that, actually, I want to address a little bit about who you are. So we've got some basic demographics of people. We've got everything from U.S. high school students, which frankly, I'm amazed you're giving up a Saturday morning. Congrats. I'm glad you're fired up about this. We have parents, we have educators, we do have some academics. Got nothing wrong with academics. We've got some fantastic people who on the presenter side have learned, have studied, have shared, whether that is they've come up with some fantastic new understanding of it, or they've rediscovered something that was there before. So we've got people from all over the place, all over geography. In fact, Madeleine, our first presenter this morning, apparently it's almost Sunday where she is. So that's kind of a rough spot. So I definitely appreciate her. So I did want to stop and say, what is this? The Society of Tolkien is not a formal group. It's a website that I cooked up just a few weeks ago. I think I came up with it at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night. At 1 a.m., 4 hours later, I launched it. So this is absolutely a labor of love. With that, we have accepted a number of donations. If you go to societyoftolkien.org/accounting, links on the footer of the site, we've accepted, I believe we're up to $536 in donations, maybe $570 in donations. 100% of that plus some has gone to running this webinar, or donations to a group that I work with, Operation Slick Shave. It gives beard trimming supplies to underprivileged groups such as volunteer fire departments, men's homeless shelters, things along those lines. So everyone who's contributed should have gotten a thank you email for that. Thank you sincerely. I appreciate it. And that's where that's gone. But I think one of the things I wanted to address is this moment, this Saturday that we're spending together is a celebration. We have the works of a wonderful author. We have pages and pages, thousands of pages. We have movies. We have all these things that inspired Tolkien and things that were inspired by Tolkien that we should stop and celebrate. If we don't do that, if we don't stop and love the things that we stop and demonstrate that we love the things, and defend the things that we love, we're going to lose them. We're going to lose them in bizarre ways. So the point of this webinar is not to deconstruct or decenter or destabilize or anything. It's to build things up and celebrate. So I've asked all of our speakers today to, if there are trolls, if there are disruptors in the session, ignore them, please. There will be some. We've already had some show up. We've already had some participate. Just ignore them. Stop and celebrate what's good and true, and these wonderful things that we have together. Ignore them. If you see any troublemakers whatsoever in the chat, anywhere whatsoever, let me know. I will deal with them. I will be the bad guy here. Yeah. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Madeleine. Let's see, a little bit of housekeeping. All of our presenters here today, I see most of them have already checked in. Fantastic, welcome. When you join up, let me know, just so I can promote you to panelist when the time comes. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Madeleine. Please enjoy, and looking forward to the rest of today. Thank you, and I'm going on mute. And Madeleine, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. No, go for it.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, Welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to be the first speaker here. Today I will be talking about Gollum and Old English. Now, what does Gollum have to do with Old English? Specifically, riddles. In this presentation, I will explore a connection between Gollum, a character from Tolkien's lore and obviously Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, to Old English. This presentation explores three main things. It's a character study of Gollum, and it also deals with Old English literature and history, and also a look at Tolkien himself. First, what do we know about J.R.R. Tolkien? He was a scholar of medieval literature at the University of Oxford, but he also translated numerous literary works of Old English, such as Beowulf. I'm mentioning this because I want you to know that Old English is a very important language to Tolkien. He studied it, he translated it, he thought deeply about it. And we can see it reflected in his academic works and in his fiction. Old English obviously morphed into Middle English and then to the standard English we have today. So a lot of the words in Old English, a lot of the words in our modern lexicon have roots in Old English. Now, why does Old English matter? First, Old English literature ranges from the 7th century to around the Norman conquest, which is in the 11th century. Notable literary works include the writings of Bede, sorry if I butcher any pronunciations here, and including the poem, The Wanderer, which is such a great read. And if you ever have time, I suggest looking up The Wanderer, poem, Old English, and of course, who can forget Beowulf, which all had an influence on Tolkien. But there was one type of Old English literature that had such a profound and interesting, almost mystical quality, and that was the art of riddles. In Old English literature, you can discover many riddles. They were playful, cryptic, and the listener had to solve them. Can you? So on the screen, I have an Old English riddle. As you can see, the language is very period specific, and it's really difficult. The more possibilities you have, therefore the more answers, the harder the riddle begins. We can see many historical references to peasants' daughters and some comparisons to women. And it's a difficult riddle to solve for very modern scholars, but for someone in the 6th century, it may have been easier. On the left, you obviously have the Old English, and on the right, you've got the modern translation. And the answer to this riddle is an onion, according to the Exeter book. The Exeter book has other riddles, many of them, but it also has Old English poems and religious writings. Sorry for that discourse there. The Exeter book is a work of Old English writings. That's very important. The riddles themselves are hard to solve and clearly belong to their own time period. To solve a riddle, you must think in abstracts. The riddles are misleading and deceptive. You aren't supposed to get them right, and that is part of the charm of the riddle. It's like someone's playing a trick on you. This was common in the Anglo-Saxon period. So we should ask ourselves, why were these riddles so popular? Were they reflective of the many invasions during that time, or were they an escape? Now on to Gollum. Who can forget in The Hobbit, where Gollum challenges Bilbo to a riddle? As you can see, It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. So with this riddle, you've got an almost poetic sense of language here, and it feels very archaic and ancient. And it's very different to how Bilbo and later Sam and Frodo talk. This is very interesting, and we should ask ourselves and consider more about Gollum. What do we know about him? Well, he's a tragic character, both in life and death. He has two lives, one of Smeagol and one of Gollum. He's obsessed with the One Ring, which he loves and hates. He's featured in prophecies and historical lore, mainly by the elves. He's childlike in many ways, sometimes naive, cunning and villainous, but oddly sympathetic at times. And in my opinion, one of the greatest characters in fantasy literature. His use of riddles is quite fascinating because he's very cryptic and very chilling and morbid. He talks in a very fractured and broken way. You can't quite figure out what he's saying, what his true intentions are. He's like he's a hidden mist, and you can't see all throughout him. And if Bilbo can't solve the riddles, well, which he thankfully manages to outsmart Gollum, he dies. And a point I want to make is that there's something ancient and poetic in how Gollum speaks, similar to how we perceive the Anglo-Saxon literary period. And I'd like to make the point that other characters don't seem to really understand Gollum. This is quite evident in Lord of the Rings with Samwise Gamgee. He doesn't really, the turbulence between Gollum and Samwise Gamgee is quite a source of tension. And to conclude, I would like to think about what we can do with this connection between Gollum and Old English. Both use riddles, both are cryptic, both are very weak, both can be associated with the archaic, the ancient, the old. And from this, I came up with a few bullet points of the power of this effect. There's a lot of symbolism and archetypes. Gollum, very sullen and sad, being associated with the Anglo-Saxon period, a time which was quite marked by famine and bloodshed. And a theme in Lord of the Rings is the ideas of tragedy and rebirth. This is a core concept in epic literature, whether we're discussing Beowulf or the classical world, such as the epics by Homer. So Tolkien does this thing where he views English and Middle-earth history through these ideas. And he humanizes the past. This is something I love about Tolkien. He has a lot of historical references in his works, and they matter. When we look at the past, we don't feel a need to demonize it. Tolkien shows us that the people who lived before us are very human. Therefore, Gollum can help us understand Old English literature, and Old English can help us understand Gollum himself. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I highly recommend Beowulf and the Wanderer for those who want to get into Old English literature. Other medieval literatures worth considering are Old Norse, Middle English, Old French, Middle High German, and when you look at medieval literature, you'll notice the towering influence they had on Tolkien. Kudos to Keith for arranging the Society of Tolkien, and I have a blog and a YouTube channel if that interests you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And that's a bibliography.
Excellent, and thank you. If you could pull up your slides again for that last your contact information and everything like that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, it's just on the slide there.
Yeah, there you go. So I wanted to thank Madeleine for volunteering to be our first speaker, or maybe being voluntold to be our first speaker. If you haven't checked out her website, Snowy Fictions, definitely do so. And her YouTube channel, where she goes into some of the analysis of some of this fiction, is fantastic. So definitely check that out when you get a chance. Madeleine, it looks like you have a few other Gollum fans in our audience today. So definitely
excellent.
connect with them. Yeah, it's a great thing to see. So with that, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and get lined up to switch to our next presenter, Kiran. Oh, we do have one question. So question from Passus is, I heard in a video once that Smeagol and Smog had the same etymological roots, along with their very similar encounters with Bilbo. Is this true? Any thoughts and analysis there?
I actually think that there's some truth to it. But see, the problem is that Tolkien sadly is no longer with us, and we can't really verify it completely, but he was a very linguistically based person. He loved language, not just the literature of medieval times, but he particularly liked the language. And that's a point like philology. So I think there's a likelihood of it, but I can't really confirm it.
Excellent. Thank you for fielding that. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and tag our next presenter here, Kiran. Kiran is an interesting one. He decided to, he's analyzed the geographic roots of Middle Earth quite a bit, and so he's going to be talking today about how that relates to the maps of Middle Earth and how it relates to the real world. With that, let's see, Kiran. Let me unmute you.
Right, there we are.
Are you there? Yes. All right, you can go ahead and share your screen if you'd like.
Sure thing. And we should be able to see mapping Middle Earth now, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Please
Excellent.
Have at it. It's your show.
Right, well, hello, everyone. As you've already heard, my name is Kiran Saulnier. I'm a graduate from the University of Victoria here in Canada. I've worked with Dr. Timothy Haskett, who created the Lord of the Rings course there. And my degree is essentially in Tolkien, so I hope to be able to share with you here some information that I really think everyone ought to know about Tolkien, and yet almost no one seems to. So my point here is simple. Indeed, it begins in the very title of my topic. I will assume we are all here acquainted with the term map, so it is to the term Middle Earth that I wish to draw your attention. Now, the first step in the understanding which we will construct, and is very important, is that Middle Earth does not have its origin in Tolkien. Now, I read from one of my sources here, the Edda, for those of you that are familiar with it. Quote, "The sons of Bur brought up the land surface, those who shaped glorious Midgard," end quote. Midgard, of course, doesn't automatically sound like Middle Earth, though I will point out the term still means Middle Realm. My next source, from which I will read briefly, is Beowulf, none other than Tolkien's own translation. Quote, "Then have I heard that far and wide, to many a kindred, on this Middle Earth, was that work proclaimed," end quote. Now, of course, this last is especially interesting, the quote, "on this Middle Earth." The implication is that Middle Earth, however much it may differ from our modern perceptions, is here. Certainly, since Beowulf quite explicitly takes place in Scandinavia. Now, I'm tempting you a bit, but our confirmation for this does actually come from an interview in 1964 between the BBC and Tolkien, from which I will also quote. The interviewer Geralt says, "I thought that conceivably Midgard might be Middle Earth or have some connection," end quote. And then we have a response from Tolkien himself, quote, "Oh yes, they're the same word. Most people have made this mistake of thinking Middle Earth is a particular kind of Earth or is another planet of the science fiction sort, but it's just an old-fashioned word for this world we live in," end quote. Now, if that doesn't make it crystal clear that Middle Earth is not a fiction, I don't know what will. Now, you won't be able to see this, but I have in front of me a map of, well, the entire creation surrounded by Yggdrasil in the Norse cosmos, though what I will focus on in particular is Middle-earth itself. It is the central realm of the race of men. It is surrounded on all sides by the mountains that fence out the Jotuns. And no, to be clear, the Jotuns does not mean giants. That's a misnomer from the Greek. A better translation is demons. In the north of Jotunheim, where the giants, or demons, better, are, we have Niflheim, the realm of frost, on one side, and Muspelheim, the realm of fire, on the other. Now, of course, it is a nice picture, elegant and balanced, but it does not particularly resemble the old world, does it? That's Eurasia and Africa. Perhaps not in detail, but in conception, my argument is it absolutely does. It is curious that it was observed by Tolkien in his essay Sigilwara Land, that among the ancient English, who I remind you were Germanic and so shared a mythology with the Scandinavians, the term for Ethiopians, that's Sigilwara, must originally not have referred to Ethiopians proper. The word itself means roughly flaming eyes and shadow. You can probably already see where I'm going with this. And Tolkien's argument is that it referred rather to what Tolkien correctly names Balrogs, that is the fire Jotuns, the inhabitants of Muspelheim. Does it surprise us that the mythological realm of fire is to be found where geographically we have the Sahara Desert? Certainly not. Nor should we be surprised, I'll carry on my presentation, nor should we be surprised that standing where the ancient Scandinavians lived and looking in the opposite direction from Muspelheim, or the Sahara, we should find a realm of ice, the Arctic. And as our evidence begins to accrete, still less surprising is it to find the land between the ice and fire to be walled in from every angle by the mountains of the world. Far from being another world then, and still less from being fiction, even a brief reflection on Tolkien's own words and the sources from which he drew, Middle-earth is precisely what we ought to expect. The land in which its imaginers lived, Europe. Now, there remains, of course, the obvious issue. Tolkien's map of Middle-earth doesn't really look like Europe, does it? Now, I spent much of my early studies on Tolkien quite frustrated by this. After all, if Middle-earth is Europe, why not simply use a map of Europe? It would be much easier. As usual, the answer is there to find for those who seek it with enough longing. Now, I read to you from yet another source. These are from among Tolkien's letters, which for me is page 144. Quote, this is from the man himself. Once upon a time, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend. Well, we know that. And then further along in the quote, it should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, that is, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain, and the hither parts of Europe. Not Italy or the Aegean, and still less the East. Now, by air, it seems Tolkien must mean what we should now call atmosphere. He is, therefore, trying to produce a story with the atmosphere of Northern Europe rather than Southern. Now, does this justify his altering the map of Middle-earth? I would say it absolutely does. Classical and medieval European historians, among whom I count myself, will understand what I mean when I say that nearly all history that has come down to us from those ages past is from a Latinate Hellenic perspective. The ancient map of the Mediterranean is the map of Rome and all her conquests. One cannot survey the map of ancient Europe and not have it be dominated by an Italian and Aegean air, which is exactly what Tolkien wished to avoid. Short of expecting one's audience all to be scholars of the ancient North, to tell a story in Europe from a Germanic, a Northern European cultural perspective, demands a new map of Europe, a new map for our Middle-earth. Very well, we have established then that Middle-earth is Europe, and we have Tolkien's reason for the changing of the map. There remains the following issue. What on earth are we looking at? How Is this Europe? Yet we will make short work of this. Once again, the answers are written for us. Again, you won't be able to see this, although you can find it online. There was recently discovered an annotated map, so commented on by Tolkien, of Middle-earth itself, from which I quote in about the bottom left corner. Hobbiton is assumed to be approximately at the latitude of Oxford, end quote. All right, that doesn't give us very much, but it's enough to at least say this. If Hobbiton is more or less Oxford, where I will remind you Tolkien lived, then the Shire is more or less England. And from there, we are able to spread our wings a bit and take a peek at some of the surrounding geography. I should like to point out how much the Gulf of Lune, to the west of the Shire, looks like the Gulf where on our known maps of Europe, we find the same Gulf immediately to the west of Oxford. I suggest that is not a coincidence. From that, I propose we may infer the following for the surrounding lands. That should be Cornwall in the west, just to the south, Wales to the west and north, and perhaps Ireland separated from Wales by that river, which may function as the Irish Sea. Now I read to you again from Tolkien's annotated map. Minas Tirith, quote, excuse me, Minas Tirith is about at the latitude of Ravenna. Now, that is very interesting, isn't it? Especially when I show you this picture of the castle of Ravenna and its 7 levels. Curiously similar to Minas Tirith, wouldn't you say? And similarly, we can put it on the map and infer that if Ravenna is Minas Tirith, then Italy, more or less, ought to be, well, we can say Eastern Gondor, which would make Western Gondor more like Hispania. Our strongest evidence for this is in the name itself for the Alps, which I should like to point out to you comes from the Latin alba, which means white. And those, of course, are the White Mountains immediately to the north of Gondor. I think we've got some fairly good evidence here. You'll notice I've also put Gallia, which is modern France, up in the region of Enedwaith. I won't get into specifics there, but of course we can infer it from England and Italy. But the rivers there near perfectly match the rivers that we know in modern France, the major ones that appear on all the maps. Now, I shall also read to you from the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun that Mirkwood, which is not a word Tolkien made up, is otherwise referred to as Wistlawudu, which in modern English, moved away from the Old Norse, is the Vistula wood. Now, of course, the Vistula, for those who don't know, is actually a river, and Christopher Tolkien points this out in the commentary. It is not, I think, a coincidence that Tolkien's Mirkwood has only one major river going through it, and that he acknowledged Mirkwood to be the Wistlawudu, I think means it can't be anything else than the Vistula. I'd like to point out that the Bug River, just to the east of the Vistula, matches quite well the river that leads to the Lonely Mountain. So I suppose if you wanted to go look for the Lonely Mountain, that's where you would do it. Now, with so many other points of reference, let's get the Vistula on our map. With so many other points of reference, I propose that we may also add Scandinavia to the Bay of Foroshel in the far north of Middle-earth. I'm basing that purely on the shape. That shape cannot be anything other than Scandinavia, especially with the other pieces of information that we now have. But there remains, of course, one final difficulty. Geographically, it is an enormous one, and yet it is already solved if we apply to the question that which we have already learned. The question is as follows. Where is my entire Eastern Mediterranean? But I should point out to you, who among us has not heard of the gods of Olympus in Greece, which is of course missing, or those of Egypt and the Nile, which is of course missing? Who among us has not heard of Yahweh, the God of the Jews, or especially in the West for us, per the Christians, of that same God apparently come into the world as Christ? Of course we've heard of these. Each of these mythologies is an absolute cultural titan. And thus, they threaten to envelop our perspective of the Mediterranean world no less. An absolute killing blow to a story intended to be viewed from a Northern European perspective. I can tell you as a historian, as I've said before, the map of Europe, when you look at it, it is dominated by cultural references to Rome, to Greece, to Egypt. We cannot keep the Mediterranean if we still want people to look at the map of Middle-earth and try to understand a Northern European perspective. It won't work if you keep the Eastern Mediterranean. We understand, therefore, why the Eastern Mediterranean should have been removed. But, of course, Tolkien could hardly leave the resulting hole in his map. It had to be filled, and it was. Everything on Tolkien's map of Middle-earth, I would argue, has been pushed westwards. The clearest pieces of evidence for this are clearly visible: the Misty Mountains and the Anduin River. For if the White Mountains are the Alps, which they surely are, then the Misty Mountains cannot be anything but the mountains to the north of them, the mountains of Germany. There is really only one contender for a great river system like the Anduin that cuts through Europe: the Rhine and Danube, which was the border of the Roman Empire. Arguably all one river. And as you can see, if one were to use the Rhine and Danube to cut off the Eastern Mediterranean, which I show you in the image on the right by the dotted yellow line just next to Italy, it does suddenly become a decidedly north-south river on our map, just like the Anduin of Middle-earth. We can thus name our central mountains and the Great River on our map. I propose as well that we have enough information to call with confidence our Sea of Rune away in the east the Black Sea. Mordor, finally, and this is where I will begin to end. Mordor, at last, we can reconstruct for ourselves with just a little difficulty. It resembles, both in geography and in coordinates, Anatolia, so that today is called Turkey. But this is not to suggest that Anatolia was the chief enemy of Tolkien's Men of the West at any point. I should like to point out that Anatolia was in fact part of Rome, so hardly an enemy of Rome. But Mordor here serves nonetheless an important function, not geographically, not necessarily historically, but mythologically. The land of the enemy in the east, behind the mountains of shadow, from whom invasions from the southeast and east proper come. These Tolkien did not create. They are concepts found explicitly in the Edda. There are scenes, for example, where Thor threatens to throw Loki away into the east, as if for some reason that's a punishment, as if the east is somewhere you really don't want to be. I should point out, Attila the Hun came out of the east. The Umayyad Caliphate was expanding out of the south and east. Now Mordor, in contrast to what some people seem to think, I can tell you that I, as a brown man, have no sympathy for this view. Mordor and its orcs are no particular race of humans. They are certainly not based on brown people. Thank you very much. They are based on orcs, and the source for that is in Beowulf, the term Orkneas, which is a compound word. Mordor, rather than being any particular civilization or invading people, is meant to be the power behind them. The Mountains of Shadow are constantly referenced in the Edda as being somewhere beyond the edges of the world that mark the land of the enemy. Mordor is what sends the enemies towards the Men of the West, which, without getting into too many details here, I think I will save it for another presentation, ought to count more or less as Rome. You can probably see on the map that I haven't listed Italy and Spain in the provinces of Gondor. I've listed Italia and Hispania. Thus, Mordor belongs really to the realm of mythological mapping rather than historical. And whereas everything else on this map has a geographical or historical argument, Mordor belongs more to the territory, to the strategy of that which Tolkien used to map the Silmarillion. The realm of Beleriand, as you can tell since we've covered all of Europe, is not so much the realm proper of Middle-earth, as certainly Europe itself was for our ancestors. Beleriand is the realm of myth that goes away under the sea in the west. But that, again, I think I will save for another presentation. I'll stop it there. I think that's been probably enough for all of you to take in.
Wow, Kiran, that was fantastic. You had me hooked at Golfaloon, but you sold me with Minas Tirith. That was fantastic to see. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be able to share this. I
Yeah, absolutely.
I will take any questions. I think I've left just a few minutes for that.
Yes, let me promote my next panelist. Okay, so let's see. Jonathan Pago, probably mispronouncing that, in his Universal History video, tells that a king being banished to the east and then after a time coming back to the west to reign terror on the world is a symbolism present in the Mediterranean world, something which Sauron does. That's not obviously not a question, but an interesting fact.
No, it is absolutely an interesting fact. I think I can give credence to that. I should point out I'm a specialist, especially in Western European history. But no, that is correct. That's a very good observation.
Excellent. So I really do sincerely appreciate it. Kiran was actually one of our first, I think maybe the absolute first person to speak up and volunteer for a session. And I was a little wondering where the geography of Middle Earth would go. And this was brilliant. Golfaloon, that was enough to hook me. So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and mute you now and hand this off to Carl. Let's see. Carl, are you there?
I am here. Hello. Can you hear me?
Okay, fantastic. I'll hand it off to you in just a moment. I did want to give a little bit of personal anecdote here. Part of the reason I've really enjoyed Tolkien, I've seen it through new eyes in the last year. Last summer, when most of the world was trapped at home, I introduced my young children, who at the time were 5 and 3, to Lord of the Rings in 30-minute chunks. And watching it through their eyes, watching that new experience, that moment where spoiler alert, where Gandalf falls off the bridge fighting the Balrog. Sorry if I spoiled that for anybody. But that moment of anguish, that moment of pain, that moment of fear was riveting and painful to watch. But then the hope, the excitement, the sheer enthusiasm that appeared when suddenly he reappears in the woods to Aragorn and crew. That was fantastic. So that's been part of my personal passion for Tolkien in the last, especially the last year. But before that, was always a fan. So with that, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Carl. Carl, you should already be unmuted.
Yes, I am. I believe so.
Yes, I can hear you. So please take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. I regret that I don't have any slides for you. But I'm going to talk some about the movie adaptations. So I've been a Lord of the Rings fan since I picked up the books at age 11 or 12. So of course I was excited to see the movie adaptations when they came out. Although there's many good things to say about the adaptations, there are a few unfortunate changes that I noticed even when I was younger. Some of the changes offend me more now that I've thought about what was changed and why. It's much like appreciating a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, most of it very true to the original and beautifully painted, but featuring front and center a big goofy grin, since the focus group decided the faint sly smile wasn't relatable to the average museum attendee. I'm not going to cover all the changes, but there are 3 in particular that underline just why the writings of Tolkien are timeless and the average creators cannot measure up even when they're making a strong attempt to emulate him. Let's start with the most egregious change, the character assassination of Faramir. In the book, Faramir is the perfect dramatic foil for his brother Boromir. Boromir was loved by their father and given every opportunity for glory, and to his credit, he did great good as a brave and heroic warrior. He was undone by his greed as the power of the ring tempted him to take it by force to defend his country, and, of course, for his own glory. Faramir, on the other hand, was scorned by their father. When Frodo and Sam run across him, he has every opportunity to make the same mistake as Boromir, to take the ring for his country and his glory. But where Boromir failed, Faramir refuses the temptation and offers only help. The tragedy of their family is that the son the father hated was the greater son. Not so in the movies. In the movies, he gives in to the temptation faster than Boromir ever did. And where Boromir snaps out of his madness almost instantly, Faramir drags the hobbits halfway to Gondor before he relents. The change is pointless and even insulting, but it does at least make Denethor more sympathetic. In the movie, he was totally right. Boromir really was better in every way, and Faramir really was a pathetic, mewling little puke, whining because daddy didn't love him enough. I can't help but regard this as bad fan fiction. I don't know the specific reasons why they made this change, but we can analyze the difference and why the movie version falls short. In the actual version, remember that Faramir has been spending decades as a soldier successfully, without the approval of his father, as a successful leader of men doing great good for his country. And in the book, he explains the difference between him and Boromir. I can well believe that Boromir, the proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for the victory of Minas Tirith and his own glory therein, might desire such a thing and be allured by it. As for himself, he is not so tempted. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. The difference in their outcomes is the result of their contrasting characters. Whereas Boromir is fierce and bold, Faramir, mistakenly thought to be weak, is stalwart and loyal. And in the books, his meeting with the hobbits takes 2 chapters establishing his character, wherein the hobbits see his company's ritualized honoring of their ancestors, aspiring to ancient glories and virtues far deeper than their captain's family strife. In the movie, this contrast of personalities and virtues doesn't exist. Faramir is just Boromir, but weaker and whinier. And with all his experience, he doesn't even begin to get over his daddy issues until he overhears a 30-second pep talk from a main character. But when pondering this pointless change, I noticed that movie Faramir wasn't allowed to have any real character development in his backstory, not until he interacts with a top-billing actor. And the true character in the book is a man of deep moral conviction. Put a bookmark in that because we're coming back to both of those. Let's first move on and talk about Aragorn. Aragorn is a descendant of kings and has long past accepted his destiny. He has spent decades preparing, and his friend Bilbo was inspired to write a poem that is famous even in the real world, specifically about his dedication to becoming king. Of course, this is a source of occasional criticism of the series. Aragorn does not have any obvious and debilitating character flaws come up in the story. When he enters, he is already dedicated and competent, if a bit arrogant. Some people don't like that in a character. They find it unrelatable. I find that absurd as a criticism. Should we expect a man with the blood and ambition of kings to have a personality like the average greengrocer? In the movies, he starts off without this confidence, doubting his ability and readiness to accept his destiny. Now, I'm all for adaptations making changes when necessary, or taking the opportunity to add a little depth to the characters. I would have been fine if they humanized him a little without trampling on his main character arc and making him doubt his destiny to be king. But doing it this way, although not as bad as the changes to Faramir, is a bit stupid. And curiously, it is for much the same reasons as the changes to Faramir. In the actual story, Aragorn is a man of character and conviction because he has had a long and successful career to develop that. He has been preparing to be king for longer than the main Hobbit characters have been alive. He doesn't need a journey to discover the power of friendship and to find out what he's capable of. He has been doing nothing else for half a century. And he trusts the counsel of those older and wiser than himself who know he is capable. Another curious similarity. In the movie, Elrond was completely right. What elven father would want his daughter to give up immortality for a man who's been on the same career path for most of a century and still isn't ready to commit? Really, it looks like they just grabbed a stock archetype off the shelf, as if the boardroom meeting was resolved when somebody cracked open their dog-eared copy of The Hero with 1,000 Faces and intoned, "According to the hero's journey, the hero is supposed to refuse to call." Let's come back to this after discussing a third change, one I consider less egregious but more bizarre. Consider the Ents. In the books, Merry and Pippin meet Fangorn and tell him of their captivity by orcs who can resist sunlight and who declared fealty to Saruman of Isengard. Fangorn had been increasingly suspicious of Saruman and already suspected him responsible for orcs carving swathes out of his forest. The Ents are a very slow people to act as a matter of principle, but this proves to be the last straw. He summons the Ents to council and they decide to march to war against Isengard. In the movie, they decide the opposite. The Entmoot rules to do nothing since it isn't their war. Treebird takes him toward the border of the forest, where he sees for the first time that the devastation is right next to Isengard. I always found that a bit insulting. In the movie, the shepherds of the trees are such bad shepherds, they had no idea that such huge swathes of their flock were being murdered right next to Isengard. Had he never passed by this part of the forest before? Perhaps this is, like the previous characters' lack of development despite their history, a form of narrative solipsism in which the entire world and all its characters do not exist until the camera is pointed at them for the first time. At any rate, he immediately changes his mind about the council's decision. Many other Ints who just happen to have been following just out of sight step out of the forest and all decide immediately, without speaking, to overturn the council decision. The movie Ints weren't just changed to be oblivious to what is happening until they stumble across it. In the books, they are slow by nature, which Treebird sums up with the motto of, "Don't be hasty." The only reason the deliberation took a mere 3 days is that they already knew most of what was happening and yet to act on their knowledge. It is like a sincere moral conviction that even when fighting against genuine evil, it is best to wait until you know exactly what to do. But in the movie, this principle is reduced to a petty joke at best, and at worst, an obstruction. But never fear, as soon as Treebeard sees a ruin, they all abandon this principle in unison. When the chips are down, they are as hasty as everybody else. Now, as I mentioned, I understand that adaptations must alter the original in some way. I am still fond of the BBC radio production, but these three changes in the world, in the movie, bear an artless quality, like they did not understand what they were tampering with. I've mentioned that many consider characters of stalwart virtue to be unrelatable, as if this is a problem to be changed. And perhaps they thought there wasn't enough dramatic tension in meeting characters who help the heroes as soon as they're given the chance. With all three of these clumsy changes, they introduced an obstacle of sorts that did not exist in the story, and then wrapped it up to get the story right back where it's supposed to be. They're less like living additions to the story than like some sort of unsightly tumors on it. And rather unnecessary at that, as there's enough material to bring out the drama without trampling on the heart of the characters. Perhaps the Hollywood adapters simply didn't have an imagination worthy of Tolkien, and who does? Or perhaps the changes were decided by a committee, the least imaginative organism in the world. I don't know. I haven't done research on why exactly they made these changes. They could have taken brief moments to show what Fangorn describes to the hobbits, how the orcs had ravaged the trees, and Saruman, who had never been free with information, grew increasingly stony and blocked off, and how Fangorn had already begun to suspect. Or bring some tragedy to Faramir with what is already in the books. Show him refusing the enemy's ring because he has no need of glory. Look to the west, to Numenor that was. I have already striven to be worthy of the great kings and heroes of old. I have no need for worship from my mere father. Then after he refuses the ring, show Denethor dismissing his son as useless. When has Faramir ever shown an ounce of the strength and integrity of my Boromir? If you must bring out the family tension and tragedy, is there not already the seeds of enough drama? There was no need for such desecration. Show Aragorn explaining how he is so certain he can be king. Put in a flashback of him putting his life on the line to defend innocence as a leader of men. They can even throw in some Hollywood red meat. Show the Rangers holding the line against monsters, hard-pressed, till Aragorn sprints up a nearby ridge and leaps, arms flailing in slow motion, onto the back of an ogre and stabs it in the throat with Narsil. And let the drama come from Aragorn, proud of his lineage, understanding that his long-prepared greatness and glory as the greatest of men is ultimately just a diversion to distract the enemy while quieter folk do the real work. But these changes seemed good enough to Hollywood. They did not understand what they trampled on, or perhaps understood too well. There are many who are not merely insensitive to portrayals of great virtue, but opposed to it. But Tolkien, to his credit, does not senselessly limit himself to telling stories in which there are no great men, or few. Tolkien describes a world with men of great character and of events set in motion long ago, only now reaching fruition. And those things are not unrealistic. Those things happen. Tolkien is timeless because he talks about those great things which are outside of our normal experience, but which still are there and which even the average man may benefit from understanding. The average man can still aspire to virtues beyond average and pursue them. It should be no surprise that a pious Catholic like Tolkien should write on such things, since Catholics have entire lexicons of saints to look up to, meant to be inspiration and encouragement for the average man to become more than average. But it is essential for any storyteller to write about such things. Consider that a leader, if he is to be a leader in any significant way, must lead people to a place they have not already gone. A leader must step forward, blazing a trail toward the place where his people are not, and they must follow behind. Or a teacher, if he is to be a teacher, must teach something that his students have never known. What is required then of a storyteller who wishes to describe something real? A story that is only relatable, that does not mention events greater than the average man's average experience, is no more timeless than a grocery list. And this is more important in matters of character than is the strangeness of the adventure. A story that has no characters with character, but has all the glitz and glamour of the silver screen in all its digital glory, is no more timeless than a fireworks display. The average man is little like Aragorn or Faramir, but when they are tried, they may have need of that courage. And sincere convictions we do not understand, like that of the Ents, are not mere oddities or annoyances, but are often entirely appropriate to circumstances we have never seen. But we may yet see circumstances beyond our experience and see the resemblance to what we have read. Tolkien is timeless because his writings have a very real depth of the sort every man needs to understand. It is not dragons or wizards that make stories timeless. In the writings of Tolkien, the question, do you want to be the hero or do you want to be the villain, is a very real question that can be given a very real answer. And in a very abnormal day, when each of us experiences situations beyond what is normally relatable to us, that choice and others like it will certainly be posed to each of us. Hollywood and many lesser writers prefer stories in which that choice doesn't really exist. So that's the end of what I have here.
Excellent. Thank you. I think you introduced some great things to think about. In fact, I loved your line. I am taking notes for anyone listening at home. Calling Faramir a mewling little puke was great. I also liked your analysis of Aragorn, where you're talking about how Elrond didn't want his daughter giving up her immortality because Aragorn was a half century into his career path and unwilling to commit. I think it's fascinating looking at the difference between the characters in the books and the movies. Which one do you think is the most accurate? Which one is the most appealing Peter Jackson got this right?
Out of which? Out of the three changes or something?
Out of the sort of the top tier Fellowship characters.
Oh goodness! Honestly, I'd have to say Boromir was pretty accurate. Like Boromir is already, what Hollywood likes to have in a good sense. He's a strong, stalwart character with much good in him. And then he has a fatal flaw, which undoes him, but then he redeems himself. Boromir is the most accurate because, he's the sort of story. He's the best sort of story Hollywood likes to tell. And Gandalf was also fairly accurate. They did make him a bit of a drippy hippie, but okay. I guess they can have one character who's just the plot device who helped everybody. But they couldn't settle for more.
Excellent. Once again, this was Carl. Thank you so much for sharing the analysis of Tinseltown versus Tolkien. I think you're spot on in so many ways. One of the things, let's see, Michael should be on the call. Let me go ahead and unmute him. Carl, I'm going to mute you.
Yeah, can I just say before I go, the BBC radio adaptation from 1981 is great. It's a faithful adaptation. It's a delight to listen to. And the changes they made are trying to bring out the soul of the story. I love it. I'm not against adaptations.
Fantastic. Thank you. If you happen to know a link of that or any of our attendees have a link to that, let me know. I'll be sending out an email probably within the next week or so with links to recordings, to slides, to whatever our speakers happen to share, in addition to sharing some news and announcements.
It's available. I will share it with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. I'm going to mute you. And I will ask to unmute Michael, our next speaker. One of the sort of timeless lessons I do try to teach my boys, and we've been watching this, is that there are 3 lessons. You know, when you're 4 or 5, 6, it's really hard to get many lessons out of this. But 1, always keep your word. If you live true to your word, you'll be in better shape than everyone else. 2, always help your friends. Don't let your friends stand alone. Stand up, protect them, help them. Do what you can when you can. And then finally, always fight the orcs. So with that, I want to hand this off to Michael. Michael, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you put on my video?
Yes. Put on your video. Which video would that be? Oh, let me. You should be able to share. So in the bottom of the screen, you should be able to hit share screen.
I just want to use my camera. Is there a way just to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me do that. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. You're going to have to put show video. And next to your mute button down below, you should have one that says start camera. Yep.
Yeah, and it just says start video and it won't let me do it. We couldn't see Carl either, so.
Okay, let me. It's not letting me turn on your video.
All right, I'm all dressed up for this presentation, but I don't have slides.
Okay.
Well, I can. I guess people can watch my my outline here. So just give me 1 second, and I'll share the screen. Let's see. I'm sorry, folks.
Yeah, sorry about that. We should be able to turn on, or I should be able to ask people to turn on their cameras.
Okay, can anybody see anything?
I see a plain white screen.
And for some reason, you really can't see my computer then.
I see your mouse. I saw your cursor just for a moment there.
Okay, but can you see some text or no?
No.
Okay, well, folks, I guess I'll stop sharing because all you're going to see is a blank screen, and you can see my gavel. That's really exciting. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time today. I'm sorry about this technical glitch. I really thought that we would be able to at least see my face, and I had a couple props that I won't be able to use. I am Michael Warren. I'm a judge of the Oakland County, Michigan Circuit Court that's located in the USA. For those of you that are international, I'm excited to be able to talk to people across the world about this. I'm a former member of the State Board of Education in Michigan. I'm the co-founder of an initiative called Patriot Week, which for those of you that are from the USA, you might be interested in checking that out at patriotweek.org. I'm also a podcaster at Patriot Lessons American History and Civics podcast, and I teach constitutional law on occasion in connection with American constitutional law at a law school here in Michigan. My interest in fantasy began with my love of Dungeons and Dragons. And I was one of those people that didn't really understand that Dungeons and Dragons really was all about having fun with Tolkien. And I eventually figured out that I should read The Fellowship of the Ring. And I tried to read it in high school. And I got about 50 pages in the version I was reading. And Bilbo finally turned invisible when he put on the ring. And I thought, this is enough of this. And I threw the book across my basement floor. I still remember doing this. And it sat there figuratively for over a decade. My second introduction was with a Wall Street Journal article that was discussing the upcoming Lord of the Rings movies and how they compared with Harry Potter. And it was very Lord of the Rings. And it started to explain the themes of the books, of which one I'm highlighting today.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt. Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt. You should be able to turn on your camera now.
Oh, that is awesome.
Yes.
Let's see.
I figured that interruption was worth it.
There we go. All right. So you can see me and the Eye of Sauron. Perfect. When I teach constitutional law, I actually begin with this background. And that is because constitutional law, excuse me, is all about power. And people don't understand it. They don't really, excuse me, just give me a second. I'm so sorry. It's all about power. And so we have a couple of great mythos that are in popular culture today. One is The Lord of the Rings. The other is Star Wars. And Star Wars is all about power too. It's all about the Emperor, who's by far the best character in Star Wars, Palpatine, trying to take all controlling authority over the Empire in the universe or the galaxy. And Sauron is trying to do the same thing. He has an awe-consuming quest for the One Ring, which will give him power and authority to dominate Middle-earth. And Gandalf relates this in the Fellowship of the Ring. This is the Master Ring. And I will use my prop here. There's our, can you see it? There we go. The One Ring to rule them all. This is the One Ring that he lost many ages ago. To the great awakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it. That's from the Fellowship. As you know, Sauron was defeated by Isildur, and Elrond tried to convince Isildur to destroy the ring. But Isildur's lust for power failed him and Middle-earth. And instead, Isildur wrote, quote, "The great ring shall go now to be an heirloom of the North Kingdom. What evil it saith, I do not know. But I trace here a copy of it, lest it fade beyond recall. The ring misseth, maybe, the heat of Sauron's hand, which was black and yet burned like fire, and so Gilead was destroyed. And maybe were the gold made hot again, the writing would be refreshed. But for my part, I will risk no hurt to this thing. Of all the works of Sauron, the only fair. It is precious." So Sauron has this all-consuming desire to get the ring. Isildur, who has the ability to defeat Sauron forever and to throw the ring in Mount Doom, refuses to do so because he wants that power. And so one of the main themes that runs through the Lord of the Rings, really the overarching theme, is tyranny versus freedom, the domination by awe on an all-power authority versus individual liberty, and the fight to the death, literally, over those conceptions. This adventure is playing out of the Lord Axum's maxim: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In fact, wielding power even to avoid its use is impossible. Elrond at the council, which develops the Fellowship of the Ring, explained it this way, quote, "We cannot use the ruling ring, that we know that too well. It belongs to Sauron and was made by him alone, and it is altogether evil. Its strength, Boromir, is too great for anyone to wield at all, save only those who have a great power of their own. But for them, it holds an even deadlier peril. The very desire of it corrupts the heart. If any of the wise should with this ring overthrow the Lord of Mordor using his own arts, he would then set himself on Sauron's throne, and yet another dark lord would appear. And that is another reason why the ring should be destroyed. As long as it is in the world, it will be the danger even to the wise. For nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. I fear to take the ring to hide it. I will not take the ring to wield it." So Elrond here really illustrates and illuminates the main theme of Lord of the Rings, which is that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so if you're, it doesn't matter who you are, no matter how good you are, when you take the ring, you will become corrupted. The archetype Christian theme, biggest sin, pride, right? Pride versus humility. Why? Because if you have pride, you believe in yourself, not in God or nature, nature's law, and that you know what's right. And if you just had the power to be able to tell everybody else what to do, the world would be paradise. That's Lucifer's fall from heaven. And that is a theme that has gone through the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is being illustrated in a fantastic way by the Lord of the Rings. Anyone that gets that ring will eventually be corrupted. And there are several times that Middle-earth comes amazingly close to having a new dictator to usurp the throne of Sauron, as Elrond put it. And yet, several times, they are consciously avoided by those who could easily take it. Gandalf refuses it. At one point, you may remember in the Fellowship, Frodo offers him the ring. He says, "You are wise and powerful. Will you not take the ring?" And Gandalf's response is amazing. He says, "No," cried Gandalf, springing to his feet. "With that power, I should have power too great and terrible. And over me, the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly." His eyes flashed and his face was lit by a fire within. "Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity, pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me." So again, Gandalf is saying, I'm not corrupt now. He understands he's wise and intelligent and he wants to do good. But even knowing that he would have the ability to grab the ring and assume all great power would overwhelm his own will. And of course, we know that he's a wizard that's thousands of years old. He's traveled, he's the great pilgrim. He's traveled the world. Somebody as wise as him understands that even his wisdom will be overcome by the desire for power. Later on, Galadriel, the elven princess, also refuses it. You think Frodo at this point would have figured out he shouldn't be offering the ring up, but he can't help himself. And he says, "You are wise and fearless and fair, Lady Galadriel," said Frodo. "I will give you the one ring if you ask for it. It is too great a matter for me." She responds, "And now at last it comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord, you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and night. Fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon mountain. Dreadful as the storm and lightning. Stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair." She lifted up her hand, and from the ring that she wore, there issued a great light that illuminated her alone and left all else dark. She stood before Frodo, seeming now tall beyond measurement and beautiful beyond enduring, terrible and worshipful. Then she let her hand fall, and the light faded, and suddenly she laughed again, and lo, she was shrunken, a slender elf woman, clad in simple white, whose gentle voice was soft and sad. "I passed the test," she said. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." So here, someone else that's ancient, thousands of years old, already very powerful, a ruler, has a ring of power already, understands that if she were to take the ring, that all would change, that she would become a dark queen, powerful beyond measure. And she decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to step away from power and I will diminish. She understands that if the ring of power, the one ring is destroyed, that's going to undermine the foundations of her power. And she is willing to do that to stop herself from being a tyrant. And there are others. We heard earlier, Faramir had the ability to get it. Really almost the entire fellowship at one time or another would have had the ability to swipe it from Frodo. Sam possesses it for a short time when Frodo is paralyzed and is taken by the orcs, and they all refuse it. Meanwhile, there's all these other people that absolutely want power and want that ring so they can do what they think is paradise in Middle-earth. And so you have this conflict. And in fact, some people, the people that are trying to get it, and especially Sauron, he can't even imagine that somebody would turn it down. Of course, if you have the ability to have full power, you would take it. And he says, as Gandalf is going to relate in just a second, It's unfathomable for him that somebody would refuse it and try to destroy the very instrument that would give them absolute power. Gandalf states, "Let folly be our cloak, a veil before the eyes of the enemy, for he is very wise and weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice. But the only measure that he knows is desire for power. And so he judges all hearts. Into his heart the thought will not enter that any will refuse it, and that having the ring, we may seek to destroy it. If we seek this, we shall put him out of reckoning." So that's his Achilles heel. Sauron can't even imagine that somebody else would refuse the power and then seek to destroy the instrumentality of absolute power. And the Fellowship of the Ring and Middle Earth is saved because he never contemplates that somebody would go into the depth of Mordor and throw the ring into Mount Doom. I think the movies do a very nice job on this. I know that we just heard from our last speaker about Tinseltown versus the books. And clearly the books are a much superior product in all ways. But I do think that the Fellowship in particular, that several scenes, the Fellowship of the Ring, several scenes where Gandalf is explaining the power of the ring and why it cannot be taken is very powerful. And that happens to be in part why that's my favorite of the trilogy. All three of them are my favorite movie, despite the flaws that they have. And we understand that. We can look at all of Western civilization and really global history today, especially in the last couple hundred years, as illustrating this major conflict between those that would seek absolute power versus those that want to stop absolute power from ever taking hold. And we have lived through totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany, the USSR. There's a lot of examples of the French Revolutionary government at the height of the terror, Mao's Chinese communist dictatorship. There's so many areas where we have seen where totalitarians do have basically absolute power, and it ends every time with tyranny, genocide, war. We've seen this movie every time come out with the same result. And so we really need to be cognizant of when we have debates today to keep in mind the themes of the Lord of the Rings and our history and how that's been played out. And of course, we know that Tolkien was very influenced by World War I, and some of that flows into the books. In America, at least, and this is true for I think some other countries, at least our founding fathers in America understood this fundamental precept. And so they took power and they chopped it up into between the federal government and our state governments. Each one is supreme in their own realm. There's a built-in tension so that they are fighting with each other. And then that's called federalism. It's also, and the federal government only has certain powers. That's called enumerated powers. And then we chop up government between three branches, one of which I happen to be a member of, the judiciary, but we have the executive and legislative branches, and they're fighting with each other, and we have checks and balances. And the whole point is and we have elections and all kinds of written charters of liberty, Bill of Rights, the Constitution. The whole point is to stop someone from being able to, or a party or a committee, whatever it is, from assuming absolute power. Unfortunately, I think we've been losing this understanding, which is why I've been involved in things like Patriot Week. I've also written a book called America's Survival Guide, How to Stop America's Impending Suicide by Reclaiming Our Founding First Principles in History, trying to draw people back to those founding first principles. So where do we go from here? Another great passage from the great author. He says, this is Frodo, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." It's up to us as citizens of the world to make sure that the rest of our citizens understand that the worst thing that could happen is have one person, party, ruling class with absolute power, because then we will have what happened in Mordor or worse happen across the world. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. That quote actually hits home to me. Well, you had some great quotes in there from Galadriel and Gandalf, but that final quote you had from Frodo, I wish it need not have happened in my time. I feel that way in putting together this webinar. It's disappointing that we had to step forward and protect these great lessons and these great things to learn. Did have a couple. I also thought you also had a great line about Saruman didn't think it was fathomable that somebody would try to take the ring and destroy it. I think that's a fascinating thread, and in fact, I think we've seen it again in Harry Potter. In the first Harry Potter's movies with the Philosopher's Stone, the Mirror of Erised, which is just desire backwards. The only way somebody could find the stone is if they wanted to find it, not if they wanted to use it. And we have that dichotomy of if your goal is to use it, that's what you see in the mirror. If you want to find it and potentially destroy it or whatever, then it appears, then you can get it. So yeah, let's see. I don't see any questions coming in. A couple of people asking for links to your book. Michael, please give me a link to your book when you get a chance. Right. Drop me an email. I'm
going to put it in the chat right now.
Fantastic. And drop me that via email. I'll be sending out an email update in about a week to make sure that everyone has all these links from speakers and recordings and all that fun sort of stuff. I think your background is fantastic.
Thanks.
Ties nicely to con law. So we should have Laura on the line. Let's see. Michael, I'm going to turn off your video and mute you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for putting this together, Keith. This has been great.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. So Laura should be on the line. But before we pass off to her, I did want to say we've gotten a few more donations. Thank you. Sincerely, thank you. They're totally unnecessary, totally unneeded, but still appreciated. I'm glad people are enjoying this and find value in this. And so Laura is here to talk about medieval metaphysics in the Lord of the Rings. Laura, are you on? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. We can hear you. So that's a good combination. All right. I will turn my camera off and mute. It's off to you. Go for it.
All right. Well, this is awesome. Let's see. Can people see me? I'm not sure.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, awesome. Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about medieval metaphysics. This is a huge topic that lots has been written and lots of scholarship about. So this is going to be like the tiniest little dip into this topic. So hopefully it'll just whet people's appetite and you can continue any journey into more learning about this on your own in the future. So basically this is not in any way comprehensive on this topic, but so let's jump in. I wanted to start with just a quick definition of metaphysics. It's a little bit hard to define. I'm not sure if we can even really define metaphysics in 15 minutes, but we're going to give it a try. I'm drawing from a book called The Philosophy of Tolkien by Peter Kreeft. This is an excellent introduction to philosophy and also just lots of thoughts about Tolkien's world. So if you're interested in that topic, check it out. Kreeft defines metaphysics as a science that explores reality, all of it, even the parts outside of the observable and measurable. So everyone has a metaphysics, which is a system for understanding the world, particularly the things that fall outside the realm of the physical. Interestingly, metaphysics used to be studied as a subject alongside the natural sciences, which was also called natural philosophy, and moral philosophy. So these three, metaphysics, natural philosophy, and moral philosophy, created a lens through which students would gain like a full perspective of the world. So there are some questions that metaphysics might tackle. Things like, is there a God? Is evil real? Is time real? How can a thing change while also staying the same? How big is reality? Does reality include the supernatural? These are the kind of questions that the subject or science of metaphysics would address. These types of questions address real aspects of our world, and these kind of questions haven't gone away simply because modern scientific materialists have decided we don't really need to think about these things anymore. But more on these people in a minute. Kreeft points out that in pre-modern times, nearly every culture around the world believed that reality was big, bigger than we can name and count and comprehend. Medieval metaphysics held a strong belief that intangible, unobservable things were a part of reality and had to be dealt with as such. Things like good and evil, beauty, truth, and mutability. Many people today know very little about medieval philosophy. It's a big topic, and also we tend to not study it as much as people used to. And to us, it usually seems pretty incoherent, a garbled mess of religious fervor, superstition, and bad science. And it's true that helpful scientific advances have been made, especially in the realms of medicine and technology since the medieval times. Most of us probably wouldn't want to go back to medieval medicine and try to live in that world, but the medieval mindset was not garbled. In fact, many of the greatest thinkers of all time lived during the Middle Ages, and I'm thinking specifically of Thomas Aquinas, a medieval saint and philosopher, who drew on the work of Plato and other ancients to set down the most clear and comprehensive understanding of reality that has really ever been written. And he also revolutionized the dialectic method of reasoning in his book, the Summa Theologiae. Despite the difficulties of the medieval period, such as poverty, the Black Plague, wars, crusades, lack of modern medicine, many advances were made in the realms of ethics, theology, and philosophy, and these advances set the stage for the technological and scientific advances that began in the Renaissance and continued up to today. So Kreeft, in his book Philosophy of Tolkien, contrasts this medieval pre-modern mindset with the modern one, that of reductionism, materialism, and skepticism. The modern man believes his world is far smaller than the things he can think about by the time he has debunked and canceled his way through the world around him, saying, and this is a quote from Kreeft's book, "This is the philosophy of the unhappy man, the cynic, the pessimist, trust nobody and nothing," end quote. And he goes on to address this unhappy man. Quote, "You are a reductionist. You reduce mystery to puzzle, love to lust, thought to cybernetics, reasoning to rationalizing, ideals to desires, man to ape, God to myth," end quote. We don't do metaphysics anymore, and I would put out there the idea that we're not really better for it. Tolkien, on the other hand, was not an unhappy man. Tolkien's world contains mystery, evil, heroes, longing, and the supernatural. I asked my kids, who have just finished listening to their dad read them the Lord of the Rings trilogy, what parts or characters were mysterious. They, of course, mentioned Tom Bombadil, the Ring, Gollum, the paths of the dead, and the dead marshes. Even the forests, which are basically characters in Lord of the Rings, are mysterious and alive. Tolkien's world is expansive. It invites us in. It is a world we can occupy. If we come to it ready to criticize and debunk, we haven't really come to it at all. As C.S. Lewis wrote in his review of the first volume of the Lord of the Rings series, this book is like lightning from a clear sky. Here are beauties which pierce like swords or burn like cold iron. Here is a book that will break your heart. The book should judge us, not the other way around. Tolkien has given us a beautiful gift, one which we can open again and again. For many of us, it was the beginning of a journey into books or a turning point toward a love of reading. When my husband finished reading The Lord of the Rings to the kids, I joked, well, you just finished the best books ever, so don't be surprised if the kids are disappointed by whatever you read next. However, the good news is there are other good books to read. Charlotte Mason, Victorian-era educational philosopher, centers her method of education around good books. The best books, she says. Mason believed that books were motivation in and of themselves to the students in her school, not grades or even encouragement from teachers, but, quote, lovely books, glorious books. She called them living books. Tolkien's work falls into this category of living books, books that feed the mind and the soul, that work on us and shape us, perhaps even make us better people. We can assume that there are other living books out there to discover or rediscover. So for yourself or the children in your life, I'd like to give a few clues to help you find these living books. The first hint is living books are often older books. So check the publication date, look in lists of classics, go back and don't disregard something just because it might be a little battered around the cover. Older books. Living books also, okay, here's clue number 2. Living books have a different perspective on how much you are in a character's head, his thoughts and feelings. Lord of the Rings is a good example of this. When you finish reading, you feel like you have been in Middle-earth, not inside Aragorn's head. Other books like Harry Potter have you deeply involved in the main character's thoughts and feelings, which is undoubtedly engaging and even addictive, but it is a modern technique and one that we should be a little bit wary of. If we are always looking for a vicarious emotional experience when reading, we may miss much of the value of reading, which is intellectual and spiritual as well as emotional. Clue number 3, there are lists of books available. One of them that is helpful is John Senior's 1,000 Good Books list, which is available online. Search the 1,000 Good Books. And he was a college professor who taught great books and literature and believed that before we can read the 100 great books, we should go through and read 1,000 good books to prepare the way and get our minds trained and our hearts open and all of those things. So that list is available online, lots of classics that everyone should read. And yes, somebody just said he was the Integrated Humanities Program Director, whatever. So excellent. You've heard of him. So that's kind of it for me. I thank you guys so much. And I hope this was a fun little dive into medieval philosophy. I hope we can take some clues from medieval philosophers and live in the world as participants in a vastness that is at once awful and wonderful, a world like the one Tolkien created. Thanks.
Excellent, Laura. Don't go anywhere, please. First of all, thank you for presenting this. I do want to have a little bit of a beef with you, though. You just expanded my reading list by about 1,000 books, maybe 950.
Sorry.
And I'll never forgive you for that, but I'll never appreciate it more. I loved your reference to Charlotte Mason. What got you into Charlotte Mason and her schooling philosophy?
Yeah, I actually homeschool my children, and that's the method we use. So I have studied a little bit of Charlotte Mason, and we do believe her philosophy is great. So yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, we homeschool our kids too. So I'll probably put you in touch with my wife to trade notes.
Love it.
Yeah, so let's see. Oh, we got a question from Kiran, one of our previous speakers. Says, I know that Christianity dealt with the question of nominalism versus realism. That is, whether the images and associated words are in one's head are real, existing independently of human brains. Based on Tolkien's consistent implication in his essay on fairy stories, the elves might really have once existed. Can one argue for the metaphysical existence of mythological realms of imagination?
Ooh, that's a little over my head.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
That is a great question. I think philosophy that's the realm where you dive into those kind of questions. I don't feel like I can field an answer to that.
Yeah, I will throw in an interesting thing I came across. Can you guys still hear me, or did I just drop offline? Okay, cool. All right, so I will share an interesting thing. There was an article that was going around this week called When Orcs Were Real, and it was talking about the Neanderthal man and what Neanderthal man looked like. And it was really interesting because it was talking about how they were hunched over, how they had longer or bigger jaws than normal. They could open larger than normal. They were covered in hair. They were had thick coiled muscles, things along those lines. So it's a really interesting sort of perspective of maybe Homo sapiens, the way we saw them, or what we are, we're actually fighting things that at a deep down level that we still fear, that would have been considered orcs if we saw them today. So it's an interesting angle on things. So let's see. Michael says he may be able to respond to this also. So I'm unmuting him. Michael, would you like to respond?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, no. I think it kind of anticipates a few things that I'm talking about. I certainly think Tolkien would agree things can be imaginatively true and therefore true to reality. So I think he would very much argue in favor of that. Yes. You even have, kind of Lewis in his review of The Lord of the Rings saying something like he's felt that he's met something of a feel of an orc before. And so I think there's some avenues to explore that, definitely.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to mute you again just for a moment. If Laura's back, you are absolutely welcome to respond. There you go.
I'm sorry. My computer actually died, so I'm glad I'm back.
No problem. I filled the time with, I just made stuff up. Don't worry about it.
All right. That's it.
Yeah, any other questions, comments? Did want to thank Laura again. Sincerely appreciate it. Really love this perspective. Couple things to announce. I'm going to flip off your camera, Laura. Thank you again, and I will mute you. Okay, cool. Couple quick announcements. Michael's going to bring us home in just a moment, but what I did want to say is thank you everyone for attending. Michael is the last formal presentation. I do have a small announcement right after his session, so definitely stick around. But I did want to thank everyone. And we want to wrap with some good news. So I think Michael has a great perspective on that. He actually has written a book on that, which I know he's going to talk about. This is just a small sample of that perspective. And Michael, I will unmute you. And please take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
All right. I can hear you. Go.
Excellent. Okay. So hello, fellow citizens of Middle Earth. So I'm Professor Mike Jahosky. I teach humanities at St. Petersburg College here in rainy Florida. And as Keith said, I'm the author of The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle Earth, which I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. It's a book which explores how we might understand Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings as what one scholar has called a parabolic novel. So in my book, I write about how we might better understand the very confusing landscape surrounding the issue of allegory, which I'm no doubt all of you are familiar with. And if you're not, we'll get to that, with regard to his mythology. And I was actually greatly inspired, among other things, by a little known essay. I've discovered it's little known. Father Robert Murray, who was a correspondent in Tolkien's letters, he was a friend, a Jesuit friend of Tolkien's. He wrote an essay at the centenary in 1992 called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable, which I thought was really fascinating. And that kind of got me on a quest to kind of learn more. So the questions we'll be kind of exploring today are the following. What would it mean to identify the Lord of the Rings as a parable? Would it be the equivalent of calling it an allegory? And I'll just give you a hint. No, not quite, especially the kind that Tolkien cordially disliked. So in this very, very brief presentation, I'm just presenting a portion of the main thesis of my book. And if you read my book, you'll know I talk a lot about the central mystery and miracle of Christianity, which is the incarnation. And what I'd like to start with is just kind of asking you to think, what does the incarnation say about how God likes to communicate with us? Again, a definition of the incarnation, you can look in the New Testament, Colossians 1:15, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Well, it seems that God prefers to speak through images, doesn't he? The whole Bible, most of it, scholars have said, is parable, myth, metaphor, analogy, riddles, dark saying, proverbs. It's comprised of literature, and especially what we might call metaphorical or mythological literature. It seems that God prefers to speak in a kind of an indirect way. God also seems to value the imagination, not just the rational aspect of the mind. So to better get a handle on the incarnation, I think we need to take a closer look at the human imagination and what exactly it is. There's a lot of confusion surrounding what the imagination is and does. And I'm drawing on many different scholars here, most of whom are in my bibliography of my book. But if you have questions about sources or further reading, just let me know. We'll start with a quote from C.S. Lewis. He says I can't pronounce the name of the essay. It's Bluespels and Flonarfar. I'll go on record for that. It's an essay where he talks about the imagination as the organ of meaning. And what he means by this, of course, is meaning is a condition for truth or falsehood. Before something can be true or false, in other words, it has to mean something. It can't be nonsense. Well, think about what else the imagination is. We know Tolkien on fairy stories, he talks about it being the ability to picture things that are not immediately present to the senses, even things Tolkien says that are not usually thought of as being real in our primary world. The imagination, Michael Ward and Holly Ordway and many others tell us, is an intermediary between sense data and human reason. In other words, the imagination takes what our senses gather and processes it for meaning and then hands it off, if it's not nonsense, to the faculty of reason, which then figures out whether this thing is true or false. Most interestingly, I think also the imagination is the faculty of the mind concerned with possibility. Think of when somebody says, imagine this or entertain this. It's a subjunctive mood. It's what if? What if God becoming human looked like Aragorn returning out of exile to his land as king? What if, look at Jesus's parables, God becoming human was like a father who had two sons, or like a man who owned a vineyard and rented it out and then went away to a faraway place? What if the incarnation looked like this? It seems like we need to bring this back to Tolkien now. So what does all this have to do with him? Well, I think two things. It's clear Tolkien was a Christian, as we'll get to in a minute. Most of you probably already know this. Specifically, he was a Catholic his entire life. He loved and valued the imagination. I mean, he did write a few books, I'm told, that kind of drew on the power of the imagination. In my book, I sort of present Tolkien as an imaginative apologist, which is a big field today in Christianity. People are writing quite a bit about it. Certainly, I don't think he was conscious of this. And of course, it's my opinion and maybe the opinion of others. It's difficult to grasp whether that was intentional. I certainly, knowing his personality, I don't think it was. He wasn't like Lewis in that regard. And if you didn't know this, I think it's well known for most people that in his letters, and I'll give you the letters here, 142 and 211, in the first one, he says that the Lord of the Rings is, of course, fundamentally religious and Catholic work. In letter 211, he says, and here's a key word, I have deliberately written a tale, which is built on or out of certain religious ideas, but is not an allegory of them or anything else. So we can conclude from these comments, Lord of the Rings was a Christian story, a Catholic story specifically, was a top priority for Tolkien, yet he was also just as passionate about this work not being an allegory. a Christian allegory. So we seem to be, at least right now, at an impasse. Is the Lord of the Rings a Christian story, or isn't it? Would it make it an allegory if it were? Is it possible even for the Lord of the Rings to be a Christian story and not be an allegory? Well, we'll try to answer some of those questions, but I wrote a book to answer them in more detail, so this is only a smidgen. Now, bring it back to Jesus for a moment. Mark 8:27-29, we know the famous exchange, perhaps, where Jesus asks Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" The greatest thing Jesus asks us to imagine, keyword, in the Gospels is, "Who do you say that I am?" Now, think about how Jesus goes about answering that question and getting us to think about it through imaginative stories, which we call parables. Now, a third of the Gospels, Brad Young, a Christian scholar who writes about the Jewish roots of Christianity, he says 1/3 of the Gospels, are comprised of parable. That's a lot. How does Jesus talk about himself? How is he talking about the gospel? How does he talk about God and the spiritual life and the earthly life that we live in as embodied creatures? He does it through imaginative narrative. All right. I'd like to go a little deeper into this. The incarnation shows us that God loves what scholars call indirect communication. In fact, I'd like to submit to you now that the incarnation should be understood as indirect communication, perhaps, at least for the Christian, the greatest example of such. The scholar Benson Fraser has written a book called Hide and Seek. It's a very good book about this subject. And he says the incarnation, embodying God in the person of Jesus Christ, who lived at a specific time and space, is clearly a form of indirect communication. One does not expect God to be man. We're being asked to imagine that the invisible God has become a visible person. He's condescended and become one of us. And he didn't see himself as better than us to do that. Elsewhere, Fraser says, like the incarnation itself, the indirect communication approach hides or veils meaning in order to reveal the actual nature and depth of the truth. So there you have it. The incarnation is the greatest example of indirect communication. Kierkegaard actually wrote about this as well. So what exactly is indirect communication? Many of you probably have already guessed this, but story is a great example of it. Parable would be an even more specific example. Indirect communication, quoting Fraser again, involves concealing the message in some way, using a veiled or provocative form of expression, like a parable, instead of presenting a simple and straightforward, we might say propositional or syllogistic message. Now, there are, of course, plenty of examples of the rational Jesus, and I would submit that parables do have a rational component to them. It's impossible for them not to in order to be good stories. But here I'm trying to highlight that Jesus spoke in an indirect manner, and it seems that Tolkien did as well. So let's go back to his letters. Tolkien seems to have understood the value of this type of indirect communication, as we've been talking about. I mean, look at how much ink has been spilled talking about this issue. Look how much ink he spilled in his letters about this. Yes, it is an allegory. No, it isn't. It is kind of, it's very confusing. We'll come back to that in a little bit, but in letter 153, he says that his goal in writing was to, quote, have as the one object, the elucidation of truth and the encouragement of good morals in the real world by the ancient device of exemplifying them in unfamiliar embodiments that may tend to bring them home. I think that's pretty clear. Tolkien enjoyed speaking in story. He valued the imagination. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that he was a Christian, but not the only reason, of course. Now, I've said incarnation is an expression of indirect communication. A more specific example, of course, are the stories that Jesus told. In my book, I say frequently, parables are incarnational stories. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that they're examples of indirect communication. And as we've just covered what that is, they're veiled ways of communicating. Jesus spoke in parables, some scholars have pointed out, because he is God's parable. And I find it interesting that in letter 89, Tolkien almost seemed to pick up on this. He said, man, the storyteller, would have to be redeemed in a manner consonant with his nature. What is our nature? We love story. We're imaginative creatures. And Tolkien then says, by a moving story, that's how we're redeemed. Now, back to Murray, who inspired me to write my book, partly. Robert Murray points out in his essay, Tolkien and the Art of the Parable, which itself is a curious title. The Tolkien's art, he says, contains many examples of what he calls the art of the parable. Of course, he's referring to Jesus's art of the parable being the original master, if you will. So what does that mean? I think it means very clearly that Tolkien loved indirect communication because Jesus did. And I really suggest you read that essay. For those of you interested, you can find it in Joseph Pierce's Tolkien: A Celebration. You can get it on Amazon. It's a little book with some essays in it. So kind of to recap here, Jesus did not reveal who he was by confronting people often with propositional direct arguments. You could argue the incarnation itself isn't that. He did not say anything to them without using a parable, Mark 4:34. So why did Jesus speak this way? What is the big deal about indirect communication and parables? What's their big claim to fame? Well, many things. I wrote a book about it, but chapter 1 of my book delves into it pretty heavily, as the introduction does as well. Again, Fraser says a parable is intended to challenge our previously held convictions or ideas. A parable is not told to people who don't know. It's told to people who think they already know what the message is. It's designed especially for maybe Christians who feel like they're losing their faith, or back then people who were hardened to the message of the God of Israel, maybe who didn't, they thought too highly of themselves. Their hearts were hardened. They already thought they knew what this was all about. Jesus had nothing new to offer. By design, parables involve familiar subjects, but they are not necessarily easy to fully understand. And what we see is that indirect communication, parables, value the imagination. They value emotions, the heart of a person, not just the mind, but also that. And it seems to me, again, from the letters of Tolkien, and a letter addressed to Murray, no less, in letter 156, that Tolkien himself had a proclivity for speaking parabolically. He says this, I have purposely kept all allusions to the highest matters down to mere hints, perceptible only by the most attentive, or kept them under unexplained symbolic forms. So I'm going to be wrapping up now. In my last section here, I'm going to leave you with a bit of a cliffhanger, because I just don't have time to adequately, I could do it, but it would be a poor job, to define terms like allegory, allegorical, metaphor, parable. I do in my book. I spend a lot of time doing it. I have read widely about this subject outside of Tolkien scholarship in the realm of biblical scholarship, and one biblical scholar puts it this way, Klein Snodgrass, he says, tremendous effort has been expended trying to distinguish parable from allegory, make them mutually exclusive literary forms. He says, in the end, we must admit that the effort is a complete failure. There's a long history to why this is, despite the gallons of ink expended. He says, Jesus does not need to be saved from allegory. I would actually boldly declare Tolkien doesn't need to as well. We might need to be. We need to look into this further and examine it with more nuance, because I think we've missed the point. And I would say this in conclusion. Let's take a look at some kind of a whirlwind tour through some things that Tolkien says about allegory, and then I want to conclude with what I think he might be saying. Of course, I don't know that he's saying this, and nobody can claim to speak for him, but I think the evidence points in this new direction. No, The Lord of the Rings is not a type of allegory that Tolkien disliked, but that implies that there's a spectrum of allegories, which I think scholars like Joseph Pierce have already pointed out. I know that he has. This topic requires more in-depth examination, okay? But let's take a look at some of the other things he said where I've arrived at this point, that there's a spectrum of allegory. Tolkien, I boldly say in my book, because Tolkien said it first, that he did write The Lord of the Rings as an allegory, but no, not the kind that he disliked. So let's get underneath that in conclusion. So in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, it's very, very well known, he says, I cordially dislike allegory in all of its manifestations. Here, in light of what else he says, he's not referring to all allegory or to allegorical language, but as a specific kind of allegorical composition that's obnoxious. This quote is often taken as gospel, and people dust their hands off and say, let's not talk about it. We'll keep looking. Letter 131, I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory, a specific type of allegorical composition. Scholars make a distinction between allegory as composition and allegorical language, very different. Now, the big one, in letter 186, he says, of course, and this has been pointed out already by Joseph Pierce, my story is not an allegory of atomic power, but of power exerted for domination. Tolkien refers, as Pierce says, to Lord of the Rings as one kind of allegory, but clearly not another. In letter 181, he says, there's no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all. It is a fairy story. So now he's thrown in another term that we have to decode and not decode, but understand. So what I conclude in my book is this: there is a spectrum of allegory. It seems that allegory needs to be understood as composition and a type of language in a story, two very different understandings. On one end is the conscious intentional he disliked. On the other, we have the fairy story. And Murray, his good friend, who also read portions of The Lord of the Rings, if I understand correctly, and gave feedback to Tolkien, who wrote this essay, Tolkien and the Art of the Parable, he connects parables and fairy stories. So we might say that fairy story and parable are analogous. They're close in form and nature, and they exist in a different realm of very delicate storytelling than the obnoxious, the whole story points to something else and it's very easy to decode kind of allegory. And of course, nobody, including me, wants to say that Tolkien wrote that kind of allegory, because this would be to disrespect the author himself. I very much appreciate the time to talk. I know I've gone a little bit over. I hope I have stayed within somewhat of the time, but thank you again for having me on, Keith. I really appreciate it. I'm done.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael has a dubious distinction of I mistyped his name on the website initially. So my apologies to you. We do have a handful of questions if you're willing to stick around for a few minutes.
I certainly am.
It's fantastic. From actually one of my good friends, Tarina. She says, is it true that he, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Lewis wrote Lord of the Rings and Narnia in a bet to see who could best retell the story of Christ's coming and resurrection? Or is that an urban legend?
I think that's an urban legend. I don't think there was any bet between Lewis and Tolkien, but I do know that the issue of whether Tolkien liked the Narnia books has been taken up by Dr. Holly Ordway, and she's really changed the way I think we look at this. Tolkien did not hate the Narnia books as much as we think he did. In fact, he had them on his bookshelf for his grandkids. So that says something.
Wow.
And he didn't like certain ways in which the language was used, but no, I think that's an urban legend.
That's a great urban legend, though, isn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
Let's go ahead and promote that one. Let's say, and then Tim says, where might Tom Bombadil fit within Lord of the Rings as an allegory?
I would see that he's more of a, and I make this distinction in my book. I don't really talk about Tom. It's just too complex. Metaphorical mode of language is a very suggestive form. I think when Tolkien's talking about Tom, he's not using allegorical mode where, Tom equals this. I think he wants you to think about it. And I'm still kind of in the process of reading up on Bombadil scholarship. So I don't know, but I don't think he's an allegory or an allegorical component, or maybe he is. Maybe I'm missing the message here. I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And last up of the time we have left, what do you think of the discussion of Gandalf, Frodo, and Aragorn being prophet, priest, and king?
I mentioned it in my book in chapter 3, but I will say that Phil Ryken has written an excellent book that's already addressed this, and I'm kind of standing on his shoulders. The threefold office, I think you see in the letter to Hebrews, that's explored. It's been explored by a lot of Tolkien scholars. I put a lot of stock in it. Yeah, I think while my book tends to focus on Aragorn, it's not just about Aragorn, but I think supremely the image of the exiled and returning king says really something deep that answers something deep in our subconscious, as Peter Kreeft has pointed out. So yeah, and by the way, I can supply you with a link to my website and my book if you need it. How should I get that to you if people want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, with that, I'll go ahead and close out and I'll answer all those fun sort of questions. So let me mute you. All right. So we do have some more questions that we're just not going to have a chance to get to. No harm, no foul for everybody. But I did want to say thank you. Thank you to our speakers for stepping up, for joining us, for really giving this, no-name person in the Tolkien community, this Society of Tolkien that didn't exist 3 weeks ago, giving me and giving this community a shot. Thank you for signing up and for speaking. And then thanks for the attendees. You guys, the conversations, the links that have been shared throughout have been fantastic. I hope you've connected with some people. I hope you've learned something. I hope you had some of your perspectives stretched. Whether we were talking about Tinseltown as Trite or the geography behind the Lord of the Rings, that was actually kind of the most compelling one. And actually also thank you for the donators. Totally unnecessary, totally unneeded, but sincerely appreciated it. If you're interested in seeing where that money has gone, go to the bottom of the society.of-tolkien.org page, and there's a link called accounting. I've got everything listed there. It's probably 4 or 5 hours out of date. So if you donated this morning, give me a few hours. I've been busy the last couple hours. Let's see, a couple of quick things. Recordings. We're going to post all the recordings for these probably within the next week. I will send out an email to all registrants so that everyone has links to that. Our presenters, if you have links you want to share with this audience, please let me know. Send me links. Send me one-liners, whatever. That email is going to be big, and that's totally fine because I think people got a lot of big ideas out of this. So that's great. And I really want to close this out with sort of one thought. Today, we saw a lot of people, a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different perspectives. We saw homeschool moms, we saw federal judges, we saw professors, we saw people who have just a love of Tolkien come together. And the things that tied us together were that love of Tolkien. It's the one that I have a deep understanding of what fueled him, what he fuels, how to love and appreciate that more. But I think deeper, there's a more philosophical thing there. Is we wanted to celebrate the good, the beautiful, and the true. And with that, I want to say we build. That's what we do. Men of the West, shield maidens, we build, we create, we protect, we grow. We don't destroy. Leave that to the orcs. So thank you, everyone. Oh, actually, I got one other announcement. So let me go ahead and drop this link in the chat right now. We're going to do this again, October 16th. We had such a positive feedback, such a positive reaction to everything. We had a whole bunch of speakers submit things in the last 24 hours. Sorry, guys. In fact, we have 2 of those speakers in the chat right now. They were my alternates in case something went screwy today. They're on the top of the list. Give me like a week to update the website, and let's go build something cool. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.